Good afternoon. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm Chuck Davis. I'm the president of AFSA. First off, I'd like to thank the Stanton Foundation for the generous support that enables many of the AFSA programs, including this one today. I'd like to thank Brian Paul from ACTA for doing much of the legwork in getting this organized and bringing in our two guests that we have today. And special thanks for our two guests for taking the time to come and talk to us. They both have some fairly deep experience in free speech issues. It's very personal to them. So that's Dr. Amna Khalid and Dr. Jeffery Snyder. Dr. Khalid is an associate professor in the history department at Carleton College in Northville, Minnesota. She specializes in modern South Asian history and the history of medicine. She was born in Pakistan. Dr. Khalid completed her bachelor's degree at Lahore University of Management Sciences. She then went on to earn a master's of philosophy and development studies and a doctorate of philosophy in history from Oxford University. Dr. Khalid is the author of multiple book chapters on the history of public health in 19th century India, with an emphasis on the connections between Hindu pilgrimages and the spread of epidemics. Growing up under a series of military dictatorships, Dr. Khalid has a strong interest in issues related to censorship and free expression. She speaks frequently on academic freedom, free speech, and campus politics at colleges and universities, as well as professional conferences. Her essays and commentaries on these issues have appeared in outlets such as the Chronicle of Higher Education, The Conversation, Inside Higher Ed, and The New Republic. She also hosts a podcast and accompanying blog called Banished, sounds bad, which explores censorship in the past and present. Dr. Jeffery Aaron Snyder is an associate professor in the history of education studies at Carleton College. He studies modern U.S. history from the turn of the 20th century to yesterday. Dr. Snyder's work explores a connection between the history of education and broader trends in American cultural and intellectual history, examining questions about race, national identity, and the purpose of public education in a diverse democratic society. His teaching focuses on past and present educational policy and school reform movements. Dr. Snyder has a keen interest in issues of academic freedom and free expression, usually as they relate to liberal arts education. Snyder's articles, essays, and book reviews have appeared in various academic journals, newspapers, and magazines. Snyder is the author of the book, Making Black History: The Color Line, Culture, and Race in the Age of Jim Crow. It shows how the study and celebration of the Black past became a pillar of African-American life during the Jim Crow era, intersecting with the development of segregated Black schools, the Harlem Renaissance, and the Civil Rights Movement. A Carleton alumnus, Snyder majored in psychology and minored in educational studies. He holds a Master's of Education in Learning and Teaching from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a PhD in History of Education from New York University. Before pursuing graduate studies, he taught English to speakers of other languages, to students of all ages and ability levels in the Czech Republic, France, China, India, Nepal, and the United States. Both Dr. Snyder and Dr. Khalid are fellows at the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civil Engagement for this 2022-23 academic year. They are completing a project called Anti-CRT Bills Come to Campus, documenting and analyzing emerging threats to free expression and academic freedom from state legislators. So let me ask everyone to please extend a warm welcome and my personal thank you to our two guests this evening.
Amna and I are delighted to be here. Thank you, Chuck, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to Brian Paul for helping to organize and orchestrate this event. Thank you to AFSA for hosting us. thanks to all of you for taking the time to tune in and spending some of your afternoon with us. So here are the key questions that we hope to address this afternoon. The first question is, what is viewpoint diversity? Why does it matter? How is it under threat? And what can we do to promote viewpoint diversity on campus? So just starting most broadly, like what do we mean by viewpoint diversity? Here we are borrowing the definition from Heterodox Academy. I imagine some of you are familiar with Heterodox. And they define viewpoint diversity. They say it exists when members of a group or community approach problems or questions from a range of perspectives. Now, it seems to me the crux here is what we mean by a range of perspectives. So many proponents of viewpoint diversity equate it with ideological diversity, and we agree that political diversity is indeed an essential component of viewpoint diversity, but we would also highlight a few additional dimensions. Disciplinary diversity, especially in a liberal arts context, is a key aspect of viewpoint diversity. So let's say we're trying to understand the war in Ukraine. Right? We'd want to hear from scholars across a wide range of academic domains and fields, including history, geography, political science, economics, just to name a few. Diversity within academic areas is also an important element of viewpoint diversity. So let's just say you're thinking about psychology. You can think about a kind of viewpoint diversity being promoted by having different paradigms and schools of thought represented. Right? So behaviorism and social psychology to cognitive science and neuroscience. And finally, identity diversity in terms of region, religion, race, gender, and so on, often enhances viewpoint diversity as people approach intellectual problems from their own distinctive vantage points. So that's our working definition. Why does it matter in the first place? Well, viewpoint diversity, we believe, is essential to the key objectives of higher education, which include acquiring knowledge, broadening our horizons, developing critical thinking skills, and preparing students to be informed, engaged citizens. Now, you can't actually legally give a talk about academic freedom or free speech without mentioning John Stuart Mill. His tour de force 1859 publication on liberty is most well known as a stirring defense for the centrality of free speech to truth-seeking and knowledge building. I think you can also look at it as making a powerful and persuasive case for viewpoint diversity. One of the ways that I think is helpful to think about this is using this shorthand of Mill's trident. So if you've got a particular question, debate, or argument, Mill says there are effectively three possibilities. First, you staked out a position, right? So the first possibility is that your view is mistaken, that it's wrong. And it's very important to be able to be exposed to alternative views in order to correct your own misapprehensions. The second possibility is that you're partially correct, in which case you need contrary viewpoints to help you gain a more precise understanding. The key there would be a kind of synthesis of divergent views. The third case is that you're right, you're 100% correct, whatever your position, view, argument is. As academics, we note that this is probably a fairly unlikely event that you're 100% correct. But even when that happens, you still need people to argue with you. And why is that? As Mill points out, he says, if you never have to defend your points of view, there's a very good chance that you don't understand them particularly well. He famously said, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that." Continuing to quote here, "If an opinion is not fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, according to Mill, it will be held as a dead dogma, not a living truth." And what a wonderful phrase that is. It will be held as a dead dogma, not a living truth. I particularly like the distinction that Mill made between inheriting and adopting an idea, also from On Liberty. Right? When you inherit an idea, you subscribe to it simply it's because it's what your family believes, what your peers believe, it's the conventional wisdom. But when you adopt an idea, you subscribe to it because you've carefully considered it. You've subjected it to critical scrutiny and analysis. Okay, so that's kind of the rationale for why we believe we should care so much about viewpoint diversity in a higher ed context. Thinking about how central ideological diversity is to viewpoint diversity, we want to just briefly sketch out kind of the political landscape of higher education, focusing on faculty, students, and administrators. Now, this assessment comes from Sarah Lawrence political science professor Sam Abrams. It provides a really wonderful snapshot summary that we couldn't approve on, so we are quoting him here. It appears that a fairly liberal student body is being taught by a very liberal professoriate and socialized by an incredibly liberal group of administrators. So this is kind of the headline. Let's dip our toes into some of the data. We want to pay attention both to the political affiliation of the different campus constituencies and talk also about the campus climate for political expression.
So according to a 2016-2017 survey from the Higher Education Research Institute, HERI, 13% of faculty identified as far left, 48% as liberal, 28% as middle of the road, and only 12% as conservative, and less than 0.5% as far right. So over the past several decades, the broad trend shows that most faculty are identifying as liberal, and we really don't have time right now to go into the data, but the growing liberal skew among faculty is out of whack with trends in the national population. When it comes to college and university administrators, whose ranks have grown dramatically over the last few decades, there's not much research to draw on. The best picture we have, again, comes from 2017, another survey conducted by Samuel Abrams, who we referred to before. So in a nationally representative sample of about 900 student-facing administrators, he found that liberal staff members outnumbered their conservative counterparts by the ratio of 12-1. So that's pretty stark. As for students, FIRE's most recent college free speech ranking survey of almost 45,000 students said that 53% identified as liberal, 14% as moderate, and 19% as conservative. Of the 208 schools that were surveyed by FIRE, 193 were predominantly liberal. At the most liberal campus, which was Smith, unsurprisingly, liberals outnumbered conservatives by 66-1. At the most conservative campus, Hillsdale College, conservatives outnumbered liberals by 10-1. So 22% of the students surveyed by FIRE reported that they often felt that they can't express their opinion on a subject because of how students, a professor, or the administrator would respond. The degree of self-censorship varied by political orientation, with 13% of liberal students, 23% of moderate students, and 42% of conservative students reporting that they felt they couldn't speak their minds. Now, on the subject of self-censorship, we also have data from the 2022 Knight Foundation survey. A majority of students, so that's 65%, reported that the climate at their campus prevents some people from saying things they believe because others might find it offensive. Up from 54% in 2016. So that's a pretty marked jump. Republican students were at 71%, which is 10 percentage points more likely to feel that the campus environment dampens free expression than their Democratic counterparts, which was 61%. So that's a quick overview of the political orientation statistics and findings from campus climate surveys. In terms of numbers, it's clear that liberals outnumber conservatives on college campus. There's also compelling evidence that conservatives feel more hesitant to share their political views on campus.
Okay, so we'd like to turn our attention now to what we see as the key threats to viewpoint diversity on campus. And we're going to focus on two primary areas. The first comes from within the academy itself, and that's the ever-expanding diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy. The next threat is from outside of the academy, and we'll come to that. We'll come to that later. Well, the first thing we want to say, this is a caveat. As public critics of DEI initiatives, we have noticed that any criticism of DEI is often mistaken for hostility to the values of diversity and inclusion. So we came up with this analogy to clarify our position. We're strongly in favor of public safety as a principle, but the Department of Public Safety is a different matter. The idea that any criticism of law enforcement policies and practices means we don't care about public safety is nonsensical as far as we're concerned. So the same logic applies to DEI. That's why we draw a sharp distinction between diversity, equity, and inclusion as concepts and what Amna and I have called DEI Inc. And DEI Inc. is the specific ways that these ideas have been articulated in administrative language and institutional policies. So there are three basic features of DEI Inc., we believe. The first is a logic, the second is a lingo, and the third is a set of administrative policies and practices. So here's the logic that we think undergirds DEI Inc. Campus diversity is a management issue that needs to be administered from the top down. DEI Inc. sees education as a product, students as consumers, and it purveys an identity-affirming safety and security model of learning in which harm is lurking around every corner. You recognize the language of DEI Inc. when you hear it. Lived experience, the intent impact gap, microaggressions, trigger warnings, inclusive excellence. This language is an intriguing combination of management consultant buzzwords, social justice slogans, and therapy speak. DEI Inc. provides a standard package of ready-made policies and practices, including trainings from allyship to implicit bias, mandatory diversity statements for hiring and promotion, and bias response teams. It's steeped, we believe, in a neoliberal corporate model, and it places a high premium on measuring progress through protocols and metrics. To oversee campus DEI initiatives like these, many colleges and universities are creating chief diversity officer positions, which is usually a VP, a vice president level appointment that introduces a whole new branch of administrative power and bureaucracy at the level of senior leadership. I want to give you a sense of what, when we talk about DEI Inc., what are some of the specific policies and practices that we're referencing here? So the first we want to highlight is mandatory diversity statements, right? These are becoming increasingly common, probably more common than not at this point, at colleges and universities across the country for faculty positions. At the University of California system, for instance, all candidates for faculty positions must submit, here I'm quoting, a statement about their past, present, and future contributions to promoting equity, inclusion, and diversity in their professional careers. Now, diversity statements can be highly consequential, even decisive in terms of shaping a candidate's job prospects. At UC Berkeley in 2019, 8 departments in the life sciences used diversity statements to screen job applicants. They got 893 candidates, 679 of them failed to progress through this initial DEI filter and didn't even have their scholarly credentials evaluated. Mandatory diversity statements, at least according to our estimation, reinforce a particular ideology, and they pose a particular challenge for faculty who are on the right or even in the center. They put an added burden on anybody who might not subscribe to conventional social justice positions, Chris Benecke, a history professor at Bentley University, put it. Abigail Thomas, a professor of mathematics at University of California, Davis, put an even more sharp or finer point, arguing that diversity statements are tantamount to a political litmus test that serve as a filter for those with non-conforming views.
So in the wake of George Floyd's murder, colleges and universities across the country have enthusiastically embraced training as a tool to promote racial justice. These trainings go by different names, including sensitivity training, diversity training, anti-racism training. And this is what a typical diversity training looks like. I should say that we were subjected to mandatory diversity training for over 4-5 months. So we speak from experience and having looked at other trainings and what they have to offer. So here's a typical diversity training. You'll be told that your racial identity defines who you are. You'll be informed that white people are oblivious to race, while people of color see everything through a racial lens. You'll be sorted into racial affinity groups, and you'll be advised that white folk use white talk, which is task-oriented and intellectual, whereas people of color use color commentary, which is process-oriented and emotional. It will be explained to you that traits like precision, individualism, objectivity are hallmarks of white supremacy culture. In order to reveal unconscious biases, you learn all about microaggressions, which will be defined as indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. You'll be told that regardless of intent, certain statements or questions are offensive and must be avoided at all costs. Here's a typical example of how microaggressions are discussed.
By the way, I got in.
Oh my God, where?
Columbia.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
How'd you get into that school?
How did I get into that school? Does she think I'm not smart enough? And don't bring up affirmative action. I've earned this.
So the takeaway from this short video you can see is they don't say anything like that ever. Of course, something like, how did you get in, can be said in an insulting or bigoted way, but context is key. Indeed, many trainings provide you with lists of common microaggressions to avoid, so completely disregarding context. This isn't education, it's a form of etiquette, much like learning which salad spoon or salad fork to use for different courses of the meal. It tells you what to think, not how to think. Hundreds of colleges and universities across the country have bias teams or bias response teams, or BERTs, as we call them. Now, these teams are tasked with investigating and responding to complaints about so-called bias incidents. Definitions of bias incidents vary by campus, but these are some of the kind of key features. They encompass verbal, written, or physical conduct directed towards an individual or group based upon actual or perceived identity characteristics such as race, social class, and religion. BERTs frequently communicate to students that no incident, this is a quote, no incident is too small to report. This was from the University of Wisconsin Stout's website. At Syracuse, name-calling, avoiding or excluding others, and making comments on social media about someone's political affiliation, belief, or beliefs are all listed as examples of potential bias incidents. Now, these are all, there are all sorts of egregious complaints that you can read about. They're publicly available in the bias response logs of various institutions. At Santa Cruz, a student complained that a single poster advertising a mafia game was extremely offensive to me as an Italian-American woman and could result in harassment of Italian-American students on campus. The poster, by the way, was duly removed.
The way you're going to give them a chance to,
yeah. At the University of Michigan, a hall director reported a phallic snow object as a bias incident. Nothing quite kills intellectual exploration and viewpoint diversity like the fear of causing offense. As a student at UC Santa Barbara said about BERTs, how are students supposed to feel empowered to share their honest opinions on social issues when they run the risk of being accused of undermining our culture of inclusivity? DEI Inc. is in effect on most college campuses across the country. College leaders, by and large, have embraced it wholeheartedly. I mean, what could be simpler and more convenient from an administrative standpoint than hiring diversity officers and implementing mandatory trainings and checking the box? Unfortunately, we're sacrificing intellectual exploration and critical thinking at the altar of DEI Inc. convenience. Bias response teams, diversity training, mandatory diversity statements, all of these initiatives and more are chilling campus climate across the country, tamping down on the free and open exchange of ideas that is so vital to university life. And before I hand it off to Jeff, I will say that this term, I was teaching a new course on the global history of free expression. I think we refer to it later. But the number of students who said to me that they don't feel that there is a place on campus, or at least not many places on campus, where they can freely discuss their viewpoints was pretty surprising. And they found it pretty refreshing to have a class where they could do it. So that speaks for itself in terms of the climate on campus.
Yeah, so if DEI Inc. is arguably the biggest threat to viewpoint diversity from within the academy, we want to sketch out what we see as another, in our view, even more ominous external threat, which comes from the legislatures in red states. This development has been galvanized, especially by conservative media, conservative think tanks, that have created a kind of broader anti-critical race theory movement. The figurehead for this movement you may be familiar with is Christopher Rufo, who is one of Ron DeSantis's political advisors. So Florida is one of just 7 states. Florida is one of 7 states, along with Iowa, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, that have passed laws restricting what can be taught in public colleges and universities. Governor Ron DeSantis, now running for president, has vowed to fight woke indoctrination, quote unquote, in schools. And Florida is really ground zero for what Amna and I see as a culture wars assault on the integrity of public higher education. Following the news related to higher ed coming out of Florida is kind of like drinking water from a fire hose. So we're just going to give a brief overview of some of the laws and initiatives that have already taken effect over the past few years. House Bill 233 was passed a couple years back, and it allows students to secretly record their professors' lectures for use in disciplinary or legal actions. Senate Bill 520 reduces the transparency of presidential searches at state colleges and universities, allowing schools to keep the identities of applicants secret until the finalist stage. This past fall, some of you may recall, former Republican Senator from Nebraska, Ben Sasse, was the only finalist announced in a presidential search at the University of Florida, where he was installed in spite of significant opposition from students and faculty. I believe faculty actually took a no confidence vote in the search. We want to focus most of our attention on House Bill 7, colloquially known as the Stop Woke Act. It was modeled on the Trump administration's September 2020 executive order on combating race and sex stereotypes. So the Stop Woke Act was signed into law in April 2022. It stipulates that professors, and I've included some of the language because the language actually is important. We need to pay attention to the specific language in this legislation. It stipulates that professors cannot espouse, promote, advance, inculcate, or compel individuals to believe 8 concepts that allegedly constitute discrimination based on race, color, sex, or national origin. So among other concepts, the law says that professors can't advance. I'm going to just focus on 3 here. So the first is this belief that an individual's moral character or status as privileged or oppressed is necessarily determined by his or her race, color, sex, or national origin. The belief that an individual, by virtue of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. And an individual, by virtue of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin, bears responsibility for or should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment because of actions committed in the past by other members of the same race, color, sex, or national origin. Now, a quick cursory look at these kinds of provisions, they might sound reasonable, but let me just talk and sketch out what kinds of topics would likely be off limits according to the wording of this law. So one is unconscious or implicit bias, which is a field within psychology in which a ton of research has been done. It's certainly disputable, but you couldn't even present the research on unconscious or implicit bias. You can talk about things like the culpability of everyday Germans in perpetrating the Holocaust. There's an entire body of scholarship that you could not read because it would violate the provision that you might be making a particular national group feel guilt based on the actions of their ancestors. You couldn't talk about the wisdom of affirmative action, even to debate it. Is affirmative action a good policy or a bad policy? These are just a few things that would be off the table according to the Stop Woke Act. In addition to that, the law seriously restricts all sorts of basic techniques that profs that Amna and I use, profs like Amna and myself use all the time. Whether that's us using the Socratic method, playing devil's advocate, right? Pretending to endorse a particular concept in order to push discussion forward at a place like Carleton. You play devil's advocate from a conservative position, right? To make your more liberal students think, and encouraging classroom debate. So if you violate this law, instructors could lose their job, and the university is subject to the loss of millions of dollars in annual state funding if faculty members are not subjected to quote unquote appropriate punishment.
So the Stop Woke Act has already had chilling effects, serious chilling effects on faculty members, especially those without tenure. In a recent conversation with Andrew Gothard, who's the president of the United Faculty of Florida Union, he relayed that dozens of instructors have shared with him privately how they're quietly dropping topics, altering syllabi, and even canceling whole courses out of fear for their jobs. The professors most affected by the Stop Woke Act are in the humanities and interpretive social sciences, unsurprisingly. And the topics most likely to be avoided, as you can imagine, are related to race, racism, gender, and social inequality. Now, this past fall, University of Central Florida sociology professor Jonathan Cox canceled 2 classes that included readings challenging the assertion that the US is a colorblind society. Cox, who's a tenure track assistant professor, put it like this: somebody who's not even in the class could come after me. Somebody sees the course catalog, complains to a legislator. Next thing I know, I'm out of a job. Cox's department chair said it was an absolute tragedy that classes like this get canceled. For the fall of 2022 semester, the University of Central Florida Sociology Department offered a total of 39 courses. And you know what? Not a single one focused primarily on race. Now, this legislation, I have to say, is not going unchallenged. The Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, has filed a lawsuit against the act. So have ACLU in collaboration with the NAACP Legal Fund. And in November 2022, the U.S. District Court Judge Mark Walker granted a temporary injunction against the Stop Woke Act on the grounds that it violates the First Amendment. It violates the First Amendment rights to free speech and the 14th Amendment rights to due process. So here is what he wrote in his judgment, and I think it's worth reading out loud. Under this act, professors enjoy academic freedom so long as they express only those viewpoints of which the state approves. This is positively dystopian. In the name of combating indoctrination of one perceived orthodoxy, the state allows for indoctrination in its preferred orthodoxy. Our professors are critical to a healthy democracy. If they are not allowed to shed light on challenging ideas, then democracy will die in darkness. The state has formally appealed the injunction, and a federal appeals court denied a request from DeSantis, from his administration, to block the injunction pending the appeal. So, as this particular case drags along, DeSantis shows no signs of slowing down his efforts to reform public higher education in Florida. He signed Senate Bill 266 only recently, and among many alarming provisions of this bill, the law empowers university presidents to take charge of faculty hiring. Academic freedom is effectively meaningless if faculty are cut out from the hiring process. Presidents simply do not have the requisite expertise to make judgment calls about the needs and requirements of academic departments and programs. The fact that university presidents in states like Florida are increasingly political appointees makes this provision even more alarming. So why does Florida matter so much? As Andrew Gothard, the president of the United Faculty of Florida Union, put it, unlike Vegas, what happens in Florida doesn't stay in Florida. Conservative politicians, activists, and pundits see Florida as a beacon for other states when it comes to transforming colleges and universities. Indeed, 538 just did an analysis that found copycat legislation being advanced in 5 states with the Republican state government trifecta, State House, State Senate, and Governor's Office. So now that we've sketched out the main threats to viewpoint diversity on campus, let's think about what can we do to actually change things and to promote viewpoint diversity.
Yeah. So we don't think that viewpoint diversity can be achieved by administrative decrees and fiats, whether they come from inside or outside of the university. In our view, to encourage viewpoint diversity, we must commit ourselves to shifting campus culture. And the best way to encourage viewpoint diversity on campus, it seems to us, is by protecting academic freedom and free speech. And this means standing up for these principles when they're imperiled. Now, Amna and I were both heartened recently by the response of academic leaders at Stanford and Cornell when they faced campus controversies earlier this past academic year. At Stanford Law School, after student protesters derailed a Federalist Society-sponsored talk by a conservative judge, the dean of the law school, Jenny Martinez, released a statement that offered a robust defense of academic freedom and free speech in the service of viewpoint diversity. She said the Federalist Society has the same rights of free association that other student organizations at the law school have. Banning speakers who hold views seen as controversial or wrong-headed, Martinez wrote, would be inconsistent with Stanford's commitment to protecting the expression of the widest range of viewpoints, free from institutional orthodoxy and from internal or external coercion. All right, on the other coast, at Cornell, the student government called for mandating trigger warnings for allegedly traumatic content. Very quickly, the university's president and provost rejected the students' resolution. They said that a policy like this would have a chilling effect on faculty, who would naturally fear censure lest they bring a discussion spontaneously into new and challenging territory, or fail to accurately anticipate students' reactions to a topic or idea. Here's how they put it. Learning to engage with difficult and challenging ideas, they said, is a core part of a university education, essential to our students' intellectual growth and to their future ability to lead and thrive in a diverse society. So beyond standing up for academic freedom and free expression when we're faced with a particular campus controversy, we think that colleges and universities can and should be much more proactive in consistently drawing attention to these values, not just when they're under the gun and there's an acute crisis. On our own campus, we've organized special roundtable discussions on these topics. We did an event back in April. You can see the poster here, teaching at Carleton during the new culture wars, triggers, cancel culture, and academic freedom. Amna and I were on this panel along with an art historian, somebody who focuses on literature. And what we did was attempt to speak directly to the students and the broader campus community about the ways in which the current campus climate was hampering our ability to teach our own subject areas, including material that we believe to be the most important and, of course, the most controversial. Both Amna and I make a concerted effort to include topics related to academic freedom, free speech, and viewpoint diversity in the courses that we teach. In my Introduction to Educational Studies course, the last book that we always read is Coddling of the American Mind, which is very fun to read with undergraduates. Amna just launched a whole new course that I think she mentioned, The Global History of Free Expression. The class was a resounding success, and Amna was pleased to see how hungry students are to engage with one another on a wide variety of views. One student wrote in his course evaluation, few courses create an environment for open dialogue like this one does. I not only learned about the history of free speech, but changed my mind. It provided me with an open environment to learn about one of the most important pillars that our democratic society rests on, freedom of expression. Now, beyond providing a space to students within the classroom, this course stimulated a much needed conversation across campus just through word of mouth. And Amna now has a whole string of students who are knocking on her door asking when she's going to offer this course again. It's a small move, right? But put it in context. If we're thinking about a cultural shift, we believe that courses like these, events like these are vital for shifting the cultural climate on college campuses.
And at the institutional level too, I think, both of us agree that there are a number of things that can be done. In fact, recently, a few universities announced special initiatives devoted to academic freedom and free speech for the upcoming academic year. At Cornell, the significance and history of free expression and academic freedom will be a featured theme for next year's programming. At MIT, the university is launching a new project on civil discourse in the fall. The goal is to model the value of open inquiry by generating lively, constructive, and respectful discussions about controversial topics, including climate change and COVID policies. A few weeks ago, UC Irvine announced a university-wide thematic year on free speech, academic freedom, and conversations across the divide. So we do think that there are some good initiatives being launched, and this is part of how this kind of institutional culture must be shifted. Now, alumni. Alumni, it seems to us, are particularly well positioned to advocate for targeted initiatives such as the ones we've just mentioned. They provide models for alums to point to and say to their alma mater's leadership, why don't we try something like this on our campus? And in addition to college-wide initiatives, we would urge alumni to look at the existing centers and initiatives on their campuses that might be interested in pursuing events and programming related to academic freedom and free speech and viewpoint diversity. Civil discourse has been a hot topic in recent years, and there are many points of overlap with free expression issues under this general umbrella. Identifying and developing relationship with administrators and faculty members in particular, I just want to underscore that, who have a demonstrated interest in academic freedom and free speech is a really promising avenue to explore. This kind of support could embolden more faculty to address these issues in their classes and other venues on campus. And I think this really does have, it kind of speeds up that change that we want to see once more than one faculty is talking about it on their campus. Offering your own expertise as alumni might be fruitful as well. We can imagine an engaging alumni panel that speaks to the importance of academic freedom and free speech, as well as viewpoint diversity in the educational or even the professional settings that you all are in. So now we're going to wrap up. We'd like to underscore the vital importance of viewpoint diversity for democracy. We turn here to a quote from Michael Carpini, Emeritus Professor of Communication and Democracy at UPenn.
Oh, I don't have the...
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah.
He says, responsible and responsive democracy requires citizens that are willing and able to engage with each other and its leaders in informed, robust, and productive ways. It also requires an understanding that well-intentioned people can legitimately disagree on how best to address the many difficult problems we face, or even what those problems are. Developing such citizens should be a central goal of higher education. We couldn't agree more. There's plenty of work to be done, and we need all hands on deck. We're delighted that alumni like you are paying attention and taking an interest, and we look forward to questions and comments that you might have.
Well, thank you very much, Amna and Jeff. Appreciate the thoughts. We now have time for some questions. A few rules of the road here. If you could please keep your questions short and respectful. We need respectful because that's the type of dialogue we're trying to model. Short to allow as many people as possible to engage in questions. Ryan will be moderating the questions. Please let him know that you're looking to raise to ask a question by clicking on the reaction button down or icon down at the bottom of your screen and then selecting the hand raise functionality, which looks like that. And then of course you can click on it again to put it down. If I can do that. And I'm screwing this up. There we go, when you're done. So with that, I will ask the first question. to either one of you. And obviously, there's you spoke about the reaction to the wokeness coming out of Florida, and certainly there's seems to be some limits, at least in a First Amendment approach, that are being crossed there. What, given the direction of the first part of your speech and the imbalance, it seems almost as if you're trying to convince the other 90% to become more open. Barring that, I guess the question is, what would you suggest as the most value or the best approach from outside the faculty anyway, even maybe from the administration, from a concerned president, to improve the culture on campus? How can the academic environment be affected?
That's a great question. Thank you, Chuck. I think, one of the things that I would say is as leaders in higher ed, I think presidents and maybe even trustees should begin initiatives, but actually I think they're likely to fail if there isn't faculty buy-in. That's why I'm stressing the faculty part, right? There can be a lot of resistance to it, and we've seen it at UNC Chapel Hill. So I think one of the key things is, even if outside people want to influence the climate on campus through some kind of initiative, the first starting point would be to identify faculty on campus who are interested, who are already doing this, and work with them to build it so they can speak to the local context, the local campus climate, and think about ways that would be meaningful to address. So that's the first thing I'd say.
Yeah, I'd also point out that if you look nationally, 7 out of 10 faculty members are now contingent. That means that they're adjuncts and they are basically at-will employees, right? And so only 30% of the professoriate is lucky, like the way that Amna and I have, to be tenured or have tenure track positions. And to my mind, tenure is a fundamental protection that allows faculty to exercise their academic freedom. Academic freedom becomes a lot less powerful when you are an adjunct faculty member. So I think part of the broader public discourse is to try and make a case. It's cutting across the grain in some ways, because in states like Texas, there have been moves to abolish or water down tenure. But I think especially for people who are on the conservative side, I mean, my goodness, without tenure, to be a conservative faculty member at most colleges and universities in this country and to speak freely, that's impossible. That is not, you can't do it. So I would urge people to think about, just in terms of public support for state college universities, tenure is a key thing here. It is really one of the essential pillars that undergirds academic freedom.
Bill Severson, you're next.
Thank you. Chuck, I'm going to follow up a bit on your question. I think first, let me start by saying, I share concerns about having sort of outside government come in with a heavy hand and reverse indoctrination. That said, it seems to me that the terms of the anti-work statute that was adopted in Florida were directed at barring universities from indoctrinating students, not barring open discussion of ideas. That's the thrust. Now, it may have been poorly worded, but that was the thrust of what they were doing. And in your first part of your talk, you acknowledged and I think recognized, that that's the sort of leftist indoctrination is in fact a problem on universities, and the very substantial leftward leaning sort of environment, contributes to that. As Jonathan points out, if you don't have some balance of inputs, into the thinking process, all of the open free expression that you want to create internally on the campus is sort of going to go nowhere, because it's going to be a bunch of liberals who want liberal free expression. Conservative ideas aren't going to make it into the consideration. So I have some sympathy for a desire for external sort of bringing external pressure or influence into the university to open up
Hey, Bill, hey, Bill,
open
it's
inquiry.
Chuck. It's
Okay,
Chuck. I have
yeah,
to
so
ask you at this
so anyway,
point, is there a
yeah,
question?
so can you, what is it fair for government and people to want to impose some sort of constraint that would limit using universities as indoctrination centers? And can that be done, I guess?
Thank you, Bill, for that question. And I think, you know, I understand what you're saying. I think this kind of the desire, I'm sympathetic to want to do and change something from outside. I will say a couple of things. First, you know, I will say that all the data we've presented and the campus on climate does lean very, very liberal. And I think there is a problem. I wouldn't call it indoctrination. And there is a difference over here, because I don't think, you know, the majority of the faculty definitely lean liberal, but I think the vast majority are doing a fairly good job of doing their work, basically teaching their students without indoctrinating them. So the indoctrination isn't, or if you even want to call it that, isn't coming from the faculty in the main. I think the problems lie elsewhere for the kinds of climate that we see on campus. So many chemistry, physics, history professors are doing a great job teaching their students, regardless of what their political orientation is the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is state intervention. I mean, as someone who comes from a country where the education system was ripped up, essentially, by political forces, and the direct impact it had on the state of our democracy, I just find it astonishing that the state should be meddling in higher education in the US in a way that is undermining the very thing that has made US universities the envy of the world, which is that kind of academic freedom that professors have, which has been central to kind of the cutting edge research that has happened in the US, and the exceptional quality of education for students, you know, the pedagogy. So to my mind, state intervention is a very dangerous step, even if it's for the right reasons. The precedent it sets is one that I worry about. Already in New York, you have some Senate bill advocating that's, you know, in response, like a copycat bill on the other side saying, well, now you're mandating social justice courses. And I can't get on board with that either. I think, you know, state legislation has to be extremely wary of interfering in higher education. Having said that, I think there are problems on campus. I firmly believe that, but those problems are not for legislators to be intervening in.
Well, let me briefly add on to what Amna said, which I think this is one of the key problems with any legislation that attempts to regulate speech. And the Stop Woke Act does attempt to regulate speech. It's the question of where you draw the line, right? So one of the big critiques that Amna and I have about what we call DEI Inc. is that it validates a discourse that is really focused on harm. And the way that DEI Inc. administrators tend to define harm is that it's in the eye of the beholder, right? If I claim that I've been harmed, nobody can really argue with me. And unfortunately, the same dynamic applies to indoctrination. If I'm teaching a US history class and a student raises their hand and says, hey, you know what? I feel like this is a form of indoctrination, right? According to the Stop Woke Act, that's a legitimate position to take. So I'd be very concerned if we're going to empower people to make these distinctions that have real consequences that are based purely on their feelings. That's something that I'm that I would be very, very worried about, because I can imagine teaching a US history class and people claiming from one week to the next that I'm either indoctrinating them in liberal ideas, in conservative ideas, in free market capitalism ideas, and Marxist ideas. So that to me would make my job very, very difficult.
Also, just to add on, I think there is a problem in terms of how free students feel in terms of sharing their viewpoints. But the research on political orientation shows that students, there is hardly any shift in their political views from before they enter college and when they graduate. And this has now been done like several times, and there doesn't seem to be. So professors, clearly, I wish we could indoctrinate them, you know? This is kind of like a professor's wish is to be able to, I'm just joking. But my point is, if only we had the kind of influence that is being attributed to us, you might see a better society and a better democracy.
Carl Noyce.
Well, just in all fairness, Khalid, I mean, if they've been indoctrinated by the time they get to college, right? They're the representative progressives among young people is way out of balance with the general population because they've already been indoctrinated. So on that point, what you said was not terribly persuasive. I do think what Bill is pointing to is absolutely correct and it's a valid concern. But let us stipulate that, okay, you don't want state intervention to correct this problem. So I'm a Cornell alumni. What do we have at Cornell? We have the Cornell Daily Sun, a very progressive student-run newspaper, reports that 99.5% of all political donations from the faculty and staff go to left-leaning candidates. We have a College Fix doing a survey of the political affiliation of everyone in the humanities disciplines at Cornell. And of 99, they could identify 98 are registered Democrats with one registered Republican. So if we're not going to have a state, and then as you point out, we have DEI statements that are continuing to proliferate these sorts of imbalances. No, I don't want to. I think this idea of good and evil and pointing the other side as being evil is not the correct way to think about it. I mean, I think human nature is that if there's a 50-50 balance or a 60-40 balance, even a 70-30 balance in viewpoint, opposing viewpoints can be tolerated in a community. When you get to where Cornell is at 99.5 to 0.5 or 98 to 1, it's just human nature that the opposing viewpoints get stamped out. So how and where are the opposing viewpoints going to come from if there's no one that holds those viewpoints on campus? And it has to be with the composition of the faculty, and how right now the hiring is such that it just continues this problem and makes it more acute with the ratios between one political persuasion versus the other continuing to grow exponentially. So it's got to be reflected in the hiring of faculty to get viewpoint diversity there. So how can that start to be tackled apart from getting rid of DEI? The problem was already there even before DEI statements were created. How do you get at that problem?
I would say, you know, this is a culture that's been in the making a long time. So I think this is not something that's going to change overnight. This is a cultural change is always slow. And the thing is, what I worry about with legislative intervention is that it lays a precedent. So tomorrow when we have Democrats in the House or in government, then they're going to be, because the precedent has been laid, there is going to be intervention from that side. And thinking about higher education as a political football is dangerous. It's dangerous because what's at stake is the integrity of public higher education and the education of the next generation. So I totally take your point that there is a skew. And like I said, that has an impact on the climate. To what degree that actually pushes students a certain way, like I said, we don't know. And yes, you may be right, they're indoctrinated before they come to college. But the shift that we want to see can't be done by diktat. Cultural shift can't be done by enforcing it from the top. That's the thing. You don't change hearts and minds that way. So you can have legislation, but if people want to do what they want to do, they'll find a way around it. I mean, this is me arguing from a point of view of what works and what doesn't work. And top-down approaches just don't work. So even just from that perspective, I find these kind of heavy-handed bills are not going to be effective I appreciate the place they're coming from and the desire, but I think the strategy is fundamentally flawed.
Well, but just
there's no solution. That wasn't my question. You're saying what is the solution?
Well, if I were to, to bring it back to your question about faculty hiring in particular, I actually think that this problem is exceptionally difficult. And I have some of the same questions that you have, right? Because once you have achieved a certain amount of political or ideological homogeneity in any organization, doesn't matter what it is, you're going to tend to prefer candidates from your in-group, right? You're going to hire liberal Democrats. That's going to be your preference over, say, a libertarian economist or a conservative economist. But I think we actually need to even step back and make a case, which is strange to say this as an academic, but is to make the case that we just made about viewpoint diversity for some of our colleagues. Because I can say this, and I regret this, that I believe this to be the case, that, Amna and I, both left of center, but we actually recognize and care about the skew, the political and ideological skew on campuses. I think many of our colleagues don't see it as a problem. And so you have to start there with saying, why do you not think it's a problem that 99% of the people at Cornell are giving, their money to progressive or liberal causes? So I actually don't think there's an easy answer. If there were, I think we would have made more movement even just in the last 5 or 6 years that we've been paying attention.
But I want to push back a little bit, Jeff. I mean, I see the problem. I'm not denying it, but I actually think perhaps the changes need to come in different ways, right? So on campus, if faculty hiring is one place, I agree, this is an issue, something we need to address. But one can shift by shifting student culture. One can shift by, so that there are many pressure points. And what I think is important is that, even within the last few months, I've been delighted to see how emboldened faculty feel on certain institutions to push back, and I feel like the tide is turning. It's not going to turn instantaneously, but there are more voices like us who are critiquing and who are speaking out openly about the kind of trends on campus which are disturbing, right? So I am hopeful. I'm not as I don't feel we need to turn to legislation. It's a slow process, but there's more of us talking. I mean, within the last year, I think the number of talks we've given is, I don't know, it's hard to keep track of, in part because there's an appetite for it and people are listening. And when we talk, then we have other faculty, not just here, but at other institutions saying, hey, really like that. I'm using what you said at my institution to make some changes. I'm using what you said to push for more viewpoint diversity in my classrooms. I like the piece you wrote in the Chronicle, and I'm going to send it to my leadership. So I think it emboldens, it's a slower process, but I trust the process. Anything that undermines academic freedom will come to bite us later in ways that are going to be far, far more difficult to undo than what we have right now.
Look, I just have to
Very
say,
good,
and then
Carl. We need to move on
yeah.
quickly here to make sure we have enough people to chime in, but thank you so much. Denise.
Type it in the comments.
Yes, by all means.
Yeah.
Denise, you're up.
Good to see you all again. Always appreciate the robust conversations. Pardon me for, again, the outside noise. Of course, it's summer and I'm on my porch and I'm going to take full advantage of that. So,
Good.
So a couple of points before I get to my question. I have served as a faculty member and I appreciate what you're saying. And here are a couple of things and I'll get to my question. I think universities are a microcosm of society. And there are so many ways in which top-down government-led actions have actually had significant positive change in our culture and thus what happens on universities. I think, for example, as you know, I'm an advocate for American freedmen. The fact that we were written into the Constitution as our rights could not be arbitrarily, conveniently usurped. That was very much a top-down thing. The fact that you can't sexually assault women at work and in the university and get away with it. That's a top-down thing. So there's nuance and balance, right? To the point about when that is appropriate for top-down and what that looks like. And I think it's always important if we're going to have this conversation across these DEI / MFE aisles. We need to add that nuance so people don't automatically feel that we don't get it and therefore shouldn't be heard. The other thing I want to just say before I get to my question is that organizational change is both cognitive and behavioral, is what the org development research says. So it's not just about hearts and minds. It's also about the idea of what's the incentive and the disincentive for how we show up, right? So it's important to note that it's not just hearts and minds. The last thing is, I think education is inherently indoctrinating. I think what AFSA and all the things and what you're attempting to do is indoctrinate students into how to think. I don't want to tell you what to think necessarily, but I want to teach you how to evaluate information. I want to teach you how to reflect on your own thoughts, right? I want to teach you how to reflect on the thoughts of others and what you read and where the information come from, to question your own assumptions, even to help other people question their assumptions. I want to teach you how to think as an individual. And I also want to teach you how to think in partnership. Education's inherently indoctrinating. There's no way around that. It's just going to have to be that way. Now, teaching people how to think, I think, is the goal. And I know indoctrinating is kind of like a word that we don't like to use, but if you look at the history of why we are in 2023, learning things about the rich, well-documented history of the United States of America, it's because some people had a specific agenda around what we get taught and what we don't get taught and how to teach that. Can have a whole conversation with you about that particularly. And I'm thinking about Mothers of Mass Resistance. If you haven't read that book,
Denise, I'm sorry, but can you get to your question, please?
Absolutely, that's my last point. So the other thing I want to say here, and here's my question. When we look at that rich history, and we think about what you were saying about resistors and the like, I want to ask, how do we balance inherent resistance to change with the actual need to get change done this generation? How do we let people decide that they're going to participate and cater to that versus finding some balance between the need to get things done, actually getting things done, and recognizing that people are at different points of readiness to participate in that process? Thank you.
I take your point that education is inherently indoctrinating in the same way that I would say education is inherently political, right? This is the idea of there's a capital P political and small p political. So yes, indoctrination insofar as you can't learn how to think without frameworks. Right. And so at some level, you have to learn to think within a certain framework and then encounter others. So that part, yes, I agree with. But I think indoctrination in the way it's being deployed by political actors is not the kind of indoctrination that there is a qualitative difference. And the way it's being deployed is that somehow there's a production of clones of a particular political ideology. And I don't think that's necessarily what is going on. I also think that this system of evaluating the bent on campus, I think there are more interesting ways, but looking at registration, like party registration, it's actually not a very good, and there's been some research on it, that it's not a very good metric for looking at the constitution of faculty or other parties on campus. I think part of the problem is that we have, and you're right to point to the nuance aspect, right? Part of the problem is we have these extreme positions, and it's a binary position, and we don't recognize that people mostly actually fall across these things. So it's hard to talk about these things with nuance when we have a two-party system and everything is coded red or blue, and those red and blue are becoming extremely more and more moving away from each other and flatter. So that's the first thing I'd say. Do you want to come in on the?
Well, I just responding to one of your comments about top-down change sometimes being valuable or necessary. Yes, as a historian, I would agree with that. You can point to many examples. It strikes me that proponents of free expression, especially people who talk about academic freedom, have done a poor job of emphasizing the responsibility component of academic freedom. Because the way that academic freedom is often caricatured, including by some of our friends who are social progressives and on the left, is that there's this idea that, it just means that profs can get up and teach whatever they want, say whatever they want. Like, no, academic freedom comes with a set of responsibilities, right? If I'm a geologist, I can't go into my intro to geology class and teach that the world is flat. That's not protected by academic freedom. I don't have a license to harass or demean my students, right? So I actually think that people need to do a better job noting that academic freedom is not just the Wild West where anything goes, but that is based on the expertise, right? The academic expertise that professors have developed. So that's just a little additional comment that I would make.
All right, ROBD.
Yeah, I think that I think it is interesting. You know, I don't know what indoctrination means if you're in a classroom. I mean, if you're in a classroom in college, you're getting a lot of stuff beaten into your head that you wouldn't normally spend time doing. You know, that's part of college, is being educated. When you're educated, to get educated, you are inherently getting some form of indoctrination, right? I mean, no matter how you slice it. So, but the concern I've got is, if you're teaching, let's say you're teaching American history, which you guys do, you teach history, or you teach American history. How do you teach the Civil War without mentioning slavery?
Precisely.
It's inexplicable to me that you can do that. Or how do you explain the American Revolution if you don't talk about unfair taxation?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it comes down to the sad thing that's happening externally that's just as dangerous and even more dangerous, as we're finding out, than what you guys are dealing with internally. With people saying, hey, you can't mention slavery if you're going to be talking about the Civil War. You can't mention unfair taxes because that's unfair to the government of King George. I mean, where does the slicing and dicing end? So do you have a way of kind of answering that?
I'm not quite sure what your question was.
Well, the question is, you're being indoctrinated inherently.
Okay.
So how do you avoid being indoctrinated? Is there some negativity to being indoctrinated?
To me, whether indoctrination happens in a classroom is less about the content that you're teaching and is more about the attitude that you are encouraging students to take to that content, right? So, you know, you could teach Marx in a political science class in a way that has nothing to do with promoting socialist or communist ideas, right? To my mind, no matter what we're reading, whatever the analytic framework is, whoever the author is, the fundamental idea in my classroom is that if you've got evidence, you have the right to critique this author. And we all have the right to critique this author. I think especially the point that you make from US history is actually really interesting, because depending on the lens that you take, you're gonna tell different stories that have equal validity in my view, right? If you're gonna look at US history from an economic framework, that's gonna bring out certain narratives. If you're gonna look at it from a
social history lens,
yes,
it's totally different.
There will be different stories that are told. To my mind, let's just take the 1619 project, right? If I would be worried if the 1619 project is taught to my son who's in 8th grade and they say, this is it, this is US history, it's all in this one book. That to me would be indoctrination.
Yeah.
If they say, hold on just a second. But if it's like, look, this is one book or one point of view that we're going to look at, and we're going to look at a whole range of perspectives, including people who critique the 1619 project, that it's not free of indoctrination in that there's a professor who's, you know, curating the content. There's some element of top-down control, but it's about the attitude that the students have. And that, you know, you can come away from my class believing anything you want in terms of politics, as long as it's grounded in evidence. It goes back to a previous comment, I think, from Denise, right? Which is the how to think versus what to think. I don't want to teach my students what to think. I do want to teach them how to think.
A couple of things. I really appreciate what you're asking. And one of the things that I want to So like the 1619 project came up. I teach a history methods course. And if I was in Florida, I couldn't teach the 1619 project. But I teach it precisely to show students where the methodological flaws are. I can't teach it without actually using it. So, and I use it as one approach to history, and then I counter it with another set of approaches to history. So to my mind, indoctrination, yes, indoctrination insofar as we have to teach people how to think within, with ideas and within ideas, yes, you need to familiarize them. Yes, you need to teach them some basic things and strategies. But, knowledge is shaped by and is constructed by competing and clashing ideas. And I think this is the academic responsibility part. As a history professor, I believe that my job is not to tell students what happened, but to tell students how various historians have interpreted what happened so that we end up with a series of interpretations. And I'm not telling them what to pick as the interpretation. I am telling them, here they are, let's critique them according to certain methodologies, certain criteria that we have, put them in conversation and take from it what you will, but I want you to learn how to pass out evidence. So that's how I would say. And to my mind, again, I see a comment, I'm not saying do nothing approach. It's not the do nothing approach. If the state legislature wants to come in, here's what I think is a good way to come in, to say we absolutely want to protect academic freedom. The legislation in Florida is not protecting it in any which way. It is undermining and directly interfering in the content that can be taught. The next thing to say is we want to reinforce tenure. The problem isn't coming, there is this idea that us faculty are doing something horrible. This is not where it's happening. Recommit to tenure, say we're going to provide more public funds, but not for administrators, but for faculty lines. Over the last few decades, what we've seen is administrative bloat has exploded and faculty lines, meanwhile, are being cut. And instead, now we're turning to all kinds of other outside actors like consultants to come in and talk to us about things. That's not the way. Knowledge isn't produced by consultants and administrators. It's produced by faculty. And I find that the attack on faculty is actually an attack on democracy. So I really think we're going to be very sorry. Already the adjunctification of faculty has had a serious impact on the breadth and depth of exploration within the classroom, because no adjunct faculty, as we've seen in the case of Hamlin recently, it's not worth taking the risk. And I get it. Even for tenured faculty, which I am one, sometimes it's like, I speak out, I'm pretty vocal, but sometimes it's like just the sheer hassle of having to take on, nothing's going to happen to me. But there are times when I'm like, my kid is sick. I don't have time for this right now. I'm not going to put this on the syllabus this term because I can't have that fight right now.
Chuck, I believe you would like to close with the final question.
So thank everyone for participating and asking questions. You kind of walked right into the final question I wanted to wrap up with, which was that you spent your first part talking about the dangers coming from within academia, from within the academy, but you really focused mainly on not the professors that we've been talking about because of the Florida law, but the administration and the DEI Inc. And then you mentioned the bloat. So the question is, particularly with regard to public universities, what do you think is appropriate in terms of managing the bloat, and maybe with a focus on the DEI Inc. aspect of it, such has been recently done in Florida and I believe Texas, kind of aside from those other laws that you mentioned?
So that's a good question. And I'd say in fact, we wrote a piece about this, that we're against DEI Inc., yet we don't believe that state intervention in banning DEI programs is a good idea. The reason we said this is because DEI programs in many institutions, public institutions, this is the difference between DEI Inc. and DEI programs more widely, is that they're also catering to first-gen students. They're taking care of their needs. They're taking care of white rural students. They're taking care of veterans, they're taking care. So what DEI is as a whole is much bigger than that. So I worry that this kind of attack on DEI bureaucracy will hurt students actually. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is any kind of state intervention must happen with a reinforcement and recommitment to academic freedom of professors. The way to change this, I do think that legislatures have a right to decide, they control the public funds. So they can say, we're going to give funding for more faculty lines, but we're not going to give funding for more administrators. 20% of the fund should be for administrators. They're necessary, but this is getting out of hand. We want most of the funds to go to faculty. And that is how you enrich a democracy and an educational experience. So those are, I think there are ways in which the legislature can intervene, which powers it already has. These are not new powers that we need to give the legislature. They control the funding and they can have a say on how that money is spent. But nixing programs and interfering curriculum is not the way. This is why it doesn't feel like a good faith effort. I understand where it's coming from, but it's not partnering with the very people who you should be partnering with, which is us.
You think politics may have intruded its ugly head?
I would also just note that we're talking particularly about DEI administrators, but admin in general has grown exponentially in higher ed since I suspect many of you were in college, or even when I was in college as an undergrad, right? Student life has just gotten much bigger. So I think in general, yes, I think that the public, state legislators, they have the right to kind of set broad priorities about how they're going to spend their money. And I would just echo what Amna said. It's not just the DEI admin. It's like, how many people do you really need working in student life? Right? Like, yeah, you need to make sure that students get their beds and their room assignments and that people are safe. And you need some sort of administrative structure there, but I just don't believe that you need as many admin as we have on college campuses across the country. Previous generations somehow got through college okay, without having that degree of handholding.
And the other thing I would say is, is to emphasize faculty co-governance. That has been undermined decade by decade so much that faculty are very powerless within the institution. Administrators call the shots. So to say that the faculty actually don't have a say, not very often in these kinds of issues. So I'm just kind of flagging that is if the state wants to intervene, they should reaffirm their commitment to academic freedom, faculty co-governance, the things that have allowed higher ed to become what it is in the US. And I think that would be fantastic.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the thought that you've put into those responses, as well as, the presentation and the fact that you brought all of those experiences to bear. Most of us are not academics, although I have some relatives who are. It's still very much a foreign environment to most of us, so we appreciate the perspective. I appreciate everyone taking your time for participating, and we'll wrap up now and end the recording. But again, thank you everyone for participating.